Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The Ghazali project represents a complex diagnosis and a corresponding solution to the problems facing the Islamic civilization today. This is the second part of the talk. Earlier part is available from links described in this slide. Before we move to the second part, the summary of the first part is given here. This is not an outline or a sketch, it just provides an overview of the central ideas of the first part of this talk. The Ghazali project is based on the recognition that the central problem facing the Ummah is an intellectual battle. It's a battle over what knowledge is, who should get it, how should it be given to the next generation. In this connection, Islam offers us the distinction between useful and useless knowledge, which is not part of the Western intellectual tradition. And in particular, useful knowledge enters the heart and leads us to success on the Day of Judgment, while useless knowledge distracts us from our ultimate purposes, prevents us from learning about the goals of our life, engages us in trivial and meaningless activities, and leads us to complete failure on the Day of Judgment. Central to Islamic epistemology is a discussion of the purpose of our lives and the meanings of our actions. And everything begins with the discussion of intentions. What are our intentions in living, in acting, in thinking, in feeling? So for a Muslim, there is complete clarity about these goals. We have belief in Allah and our Prophet and the message. And these provide detailed discussions about what are good actions and what are bad actions, how we should think, feel, and act. For non-Muslims, the search must start in the same place. There must be a discussion of purpose, meaning of life. This must be the first question before we answer all others, because the answers to all other questions depends on the purpose for which we live. The Prophet ﷺ made dua for useful knowledge and made dua for protection from useless knowledge. So this is a crucial distinction. But if there is no goals in sight, if goals are never discussed, then the idea of useful and useless no longer becomes meaningful. So the central ideas of the part 2 discusses the three key topics which are missing from the Western intellectual tradition, and that is what is the purpose of our lives. This is not explicitly discussed, but by action, by practice, by pedagogy, some concealed purposes are imposed on the students. Also, the Western intellectual tradition claims to be without any link to morals, but in fact it is built on toxic moral foundations. The structure of knowledge pretends to be objective and uses the code word rationality to hide a large number of assumptions about the nature of the world we live in and nature of good and bad. The key Western blind spot is their failure to recognize that all knowledge must be built on moral foundations. They explicitly deny this and say the opposite is true, that moral foundations are unnecessary and in fact impossible for building knowledge. But in fact, as we will see, all actions depend on morality. And morality can be defined in a more general way than just from purely Islamic point of view. Once we have specified the life goals, then any action which leads us to achieving of our life goals is moral, and all actions which distract or prevent us are immoral. But if we never discuss what are the goals of our life, then it is impossible to construct a way of life. It is, I will use the word deen from time to time in this talk, because this world has no correspondent in Western intellectual tradition. Actually, deen is part of religion, but in the West, the deen aspect of Christianity was removed from it and it was changed to be a personal belief system, and that causes a major set of confusions in terms of when Western scholars discuss with Islamic scholars about any topic. There is a mixture, there is a terminological confusion. Lewis Carroll has explained very beautifully how lack of purpose leads to loss of meaningful action. When Alice asked the Cheshire Cat where should it go, the Cheshire Cat asks, what is your purpose? And when she says it doesn't matter, she doesn't have any specific purpose, then the answer is then it doesn't matter which path you follow. So to choose the path we want to follow, we must specify the goals of our life. Rejection of Christianity led to deep intellectual trauma in the West. They had to search for sources of knowledge because they had rejected the major basis on which all their intellectual tradition disciplines were built. And so after having rejected religion, they came upon the idea that all knowledge must be built on observations and logic. And this is actually a mistake in the sense that knowledge cannot be acquired purely from observations and logic. But this is the position that was adapted by all major Enlightenment philosophers, starting with Descartes, the father of Western philosophy, who says that suppose I start in a position of complete doubt, I know nothing, I start at zero, then I can come to the conclusion that I exist. And from this he can move further and eventually get to rebuild the entire structure of human knowledge. Unfortunately, this kind of deduction is flawed. It is not possible to build knowledge from zero. David Hume also comes to the same conclusion. Locke denies the existence of inbuilt knowledge. And this is essential because human beings are built with the knowledge of God in them, and there are many, many aspects of the world that we are born knowing. So Kant came to this realization that you can't build knowledge from zero, but then he confused matters by saying that there is some kinds of a priori knowledge that we have about the world. We are born with built knowledge about the world around us, but this kind of knowledge, he says, can be derived from reason, and that is a big mistake. The a priori knowledge does not come from reason, it comes from God. Islam teaches us is that our heart is a guide to the truth, but European empiricism and rationalism deny this idea. They first of all deny the role of the heart and also the role of built-in knowledge, and they say that all knowledge comes from observations and logic, and this is the foundation of Western philosophy, and this is fundamentally flawed. So, to contrast with Islamic tradition, we can characterize Western tradition as epistemic arrogance, the idea that you can start with complete zero and then arrive at certain knowledge. And this idea that you can do this is the basis of the Western intellectual tradition. As opposed to this, the Quran teaches us that we have not been given very little knowledge, and with using our observations and logic, we cannot get very far. There are three well-known methods of arriving at knowledge. One is deduction. You start from some known premises and deduce by logic some new statements. This is the only sure method. Induction is when you look at a pattern of events and try to guess at the reason behind them, and abduction tries to reach to a simple explanation for some complex phenomena. But of these, the second two are purely guesswork and can always be wrong. Deduction leads to certain knowledge, but it starts with certain knowledge. And so the fundamental problem of Western philosophy, how to start from zero to get to certain knowledge, has no solution. And this is very simple because all the methods of induction, either you start from premises or you get to uncertainty. Only if you have start with certainty, then you can get to certainty. If you start from a position of uncertainty, you will always remain uncertain. This very simple fact is not understood in Western philosophy. The epistemic arrogance of the West leads to very severe conclusions. Because once you say that knowledge is only what comes from observations and logic, and there is no built-in knowledge, and the heart is not a source of knowledge, intuitions are rejected, our feelings about the truth are rejected, then you have very grave consequences. You have to reject God because there is no observational evidence. Our eyes do not see. You have to reject afterlife. We can never see what happens after we die. And of course, day of judgment is not accessible to us from observation and logic. The central problem that this creates is that then our lives are meaningless. We have no purpose, and our observation and logic cannot explain the purpose of our lives. And once purpose is denied, then our life is a tragedy. No matter what we do, whether we do good, whether we do evil, it makes no difference. Nobody is watching, nobody cares. And this is a very tragic view of life, which is at the basis of the Western intellectual tradition. So the Western intellectual tradition, which we can label secular modernity, is founded in the rejection of God. As we discussed, rejection of Christianity was based on a century of never-ending wars between Christian factions, and that led them to reject religion of Christianity. And then there's a European superiority complex that if Christianity is wrong, then we don't need to examine other religions, because as Europeans, this is our religion and this must be the best of all religions. So they never examined whether Buddhism or Islam or some other type of religion might provide a solution. They rejected all religions. And after having rejected religion, they were forced to search anew for secure foundations of knowledge. And the only way to arrive at knowledge is on a moral foundation, but they had no source of morals after rejecting Christianity. So this is what led to them to the necessity of epistemic arrogance, that we must be able to acquire knowledge by observation and logic, because there was no other way. They had no moral foundations. And this epistemic arrogance led to the rejection of testimony of the heart, of God, of afterlife and a judgment, which makes it impossible to derive morality. Nietzsche was one of the few to recognize this problem, and he talked about the death of God and how this means that there is no meaning to lives and there is no source of morals, and we can do anything we want. And he said that the Western intellectuals have shied away from grasping this conclusion, and they have not recognized the enormous significance of this rejection of God. To understand secular modernity, it's helpful to look at its opposite, which is what Islam teaches us. So if there is no God, judgment, afterlife, then the entire focus of our considerations must be this life. And to talk about afterlife and judgment is to be irrational. As opposed to this, Islam teaches us that the goal of our life is not to maximize pleasure, power, and wealth, which is necessarily the consequence of secular modernity. In fact, the goal of life is to obey the orders of Allah according to the Sunnah of the Prophet in every domain of life, and true success lies on the Day of Judgment. What happens, ups and downs of this world, are trivial. So these are radically different views about how we should spend our lives on this planet, and obviously this has radically different consequences for the deen, or the way of life that we should follow. Central to the Ghazali project is the focus on the body of knowledge created by the West. Now, when the West redefined its goals, then it also redefines its knowledge. What is useful knowledge for the West is the knowledge that will help us to achieve our worldly goals, to get power, to get prestige, to get pleasure, as opposed to this, Islam has a specific discussion of what is useful knowledge and useless knowledge. And basically, useful knowledge is that which leads to success on the day of judgment. And that requires knowledge of our intention and acting with purpose, that we should use knowledge for the service of creation of God, for the sake of the love of God, while seeking no personal benefits for ourselves, for our nafs. The basis of Western social science is a view about this world which is the opposite of what Islam teaches us. So Western intellectuals think that the universe was created by an accident, and so all of our life is completely meaningless, and basically this life is about the survival of the fittest. There are no morals. It's a battle of survival. Whoever you can use whatever method you want to survive, and there are no morals, and this world is a jungle of fierce competition with no rules. Unfortunately, part of the Western intellectual tradition is to never discuss these moral foundations. So the students in Western universities study chemistry, biology, maths, physics, and they are absorbed this toxic worldview without any explicit discussion. So in Islam, a student is supposed to ask before studying a body of knowledge, is this useful knowledge or harmful knowledge? Will this knowledge help me to grow spiritually, become a better person, increase my love of Allah, and have weight in the scales of judgment? These questions are never raised in the Western intellectual tradition. Any discussion of knowledge must start with a discussion of God, because if we assume God exists, then everything changes. Then everything has to be done according to what God wants us to do. If we deny God, that also is extremely meaningful, because that means that there are no consequences to our actions. We can live as we please. There are no moral constraints, no responsibility to society, no responsibility to future. As somebody wrote, we have to go beyond good and evil. Good and evil have no longer any meaning. And suppose that, like many people, we say, maybe I don't know the answer. Then again, this still has a dramatic impact, because then we must spend our energy to make sure that we come upon an answer, because everything we do depends on the answer. So Western education simply does not discuss this question and pretends that this question is not important. That because they claim that what we study, it doesn't matter. We can find out that 2 + 2 = 4 without discussing whether God exists or not. But this is not actually true. All knowledge must be built on moral foundations, and there is no ethically neutral knowledge. So we will conclude this talk by discussing 3 fields of knowledge, and we will show how rejection of God dramatically affects the structure of these fields of knowledge, despite the Western claim that our knowledge structures are objective and not dependent on moral foundations. The first example is an MBA in the West, and all over the world, students are being trained to run business so as to maximize profits. The bottom line is that you should have more and more profits. It doesn't matter what you do in order to maximize the profit. Even provision of service to the public, the corporate social responsibility, has the point of view that if you give charity, that uplifts your image and helps you to make more profits. As opposed to this, the Islamic model inverts this and says that we must earn profits in order to provide service. And the service of the creation of God for the sake of the love of God is among the best of deeds. And so when we earn profits, there must be a reason for this. In fact, one reason to earn profits is to pay salaries to employees to keep them motivated to provide good service. And if we retain profits, this should be for research and investment to provide better service. And the conceptualization of business is that all of our employees, the boss to the bottom, the lowliest one, are engaged in a collective effort to provide service to the public. So the business is meaningful. It is not just a meaningless pursuit of money for its own sake. A second example of how the entire knowledge discipline is impacted by this rejection of God, economics provides a perfect example. It starts by the assumption that all rational human beings maximize the pleasure they get from goods and services. Why? Because once you reject God, then the only thing that matters is your pursuit of pleasure. Nothing else matters. But this is actually a self-contradictory stance taken by the economist. Even if we are concerned only about our well-being in this world, goods and services are not means to achieve this. Long-term well-being comes from building our character and from our social relationships. This theory that human beings maximize pleasure is empirically false. Lots of studies of human behavior show that this is not how humans behave, and it is also morally toxic. If you seek pleasure and damage your relationships with others, this actually leads to lots of unhappiness. So we can conclude that economics, which teaches us the worship of the nafs, is useless or harmful knowledge. Teaching it as a truth is prohibited for Muslims because the Prophet ﷺ made dua for protection from knowledge which does not bring benefit to the heart. And actually, studying economics is harmful to our hearts because economics preaches that everyone should be greedy and selfish. And so these are bad lessons to teach students. The third example is, surprisingly, statistics. It was invented by Ronald Fisher in the early 20th century to prove the superiority of the white race over the others and to prove that this would persist over generations. Correlations were invented to show that the characteristics of the parents were inherited by the children, and analysis of variances were invented to show that the variations in the characteristics of children could be explained by the variations in the characteristics of the parents. So these techniques that were developed rely crucially on unjustified and false assumptions about data distributions, which makes it very easy to lie with statistics. And the most popular book in statistics has the title How to Lie with Statistics. So in other places I have explained why this approach is fundamentally flawed and must be discarded. The whole century of build-up on Ronald Fisher's ideas has to be discarded, and we have to rebuild statistics from scratch, starting on proper moral foundations. So we can conclude this talk by noting that the rejection of Christianity led to the necessity of rebuilding the entire stock of human knowledge from zero in the West. But this is an impossible task. We cannot start from zero to build knowledge. You have to start with some axioms. The Western intellectuals solved this dilemma by hiding the axioms. Instead of openly saying, okay, we can't build knowledge from zero, so let us assume X, Y, and Z, and we'll take these for granted. This is an acceptable approach. Instead, they created these axioms, but they hid them underground under the code word rationality. So whatever they assume, like rational human beings maximize pleasure, here rationality refers to the idea that you must reject God and afterlife and judgment. So rationality means relying solely on observation and logic and rejecting testimony of the heart. And this is obviously a very strong moral stance, but this is not displayed as a moral stance. It is claimed that this is just observations and logic. And this false extension of rationality to areas which it doesn't cover is at the heart of Western intellectual tradition. The problem with Western concealment of morals is not whatever they do, that's fine. But the problem is that Western education is global, and all over the world, Muslim youth are being indoctrinated into this toxic worldview, which is built on the dramatically wrong moral foundations. So today, we cannot get by without Western education either. So the burning need is to develop an alternative to the Western education, which is built on Islamic moral foundations. This is not being done because people do not recognize the toxic moral foundations of the West because they have been concealed. And they accept Western claims that our education is rational and objective and secular and equally applicable to all. So the central of goal of the Ghazali project is to contest the Western intellectual tradition on the domains of knowledge itself. The main battle we need to fight is the intellectual battle. And one approach, one online course in statistics along these lines has already been developed, and links are provided in the write-up for this talk, and also a sketch of how we can develop an alternative to the entire body of Western social science is also given separately. So we conclude this talk with the dua that Allahumma arina haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittibahu wa arina batila batilan warzuqna ijtinabahu. Oh Allah, guide us to the paths which lead to your pleasure and prevent us from following the paths which are harmful to us and displeasing to you. Only you are the best of guides. Birahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun al mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.